I caught my husband with another woman. But the real blow was when I realized who she was. I still remember that second, because it was in that second that my life split into two parts: everything that was before and everything that began after. And I understand this so clearly that sometimes it seems as if my brain specifically fixed every detail, just so I could never convince myself it was a dream or some strange misunderstanding. Because that day, I simply came home earlier than usual after a canceled work meeting. I was even somewhat happy about it, because lately work had been complete chaos due to a large project we were running across different offices. And I thought that at least one evening I could spend peacefully, sorting through documents and finally feeling that I had a normal life with a husband, a home, and at least some stability. And that is precisely why what happened next was so devastating that my brain kept trying to find any explanation that wouldn't destroy the entire picture of my past. When I opened the door, the first sensation was strange and very quiet, because sometimes you haven't seen or understood anything yet, but your body reacts before your mind. And I had the feeling that I had entered not my own home, but someone else's place, where I had accidentally ended up, and where I shouldn't have been allowed to see what was happening now. I took several steps down the hallway, holding my bag and a folder with documents, and at some point I heard a muffled sound from the bedroom. That was the moment when a normal person would probably have understood everything immediately, but my brain started doing the exact opposite. It began inventing any logical explanations that could make the situation ordinary: that the TV was on, that it was a sound from the neighboring apartment, that my husband was talking on the phone, or had simply dropped something heavy. I literally felt a strange mode of denial turning on inside me, when you already suspect the truth, but try with all your might not to formulate it. I stopped at the bedroom door and stood there for several seconds, because I had the feeling that if I opened this door, my life would become different. It sounds dramatic, but that is exactly how it felt, as if I was standing before a point after which there would be no going back. Stupid thoughts began flashing through my head, like that perhaps I was just overthinking things, that I was stressed from work, that my husband should be at work right now, and that this was just a chain of strange coincidences. But my body kept moving forward, because it's impossible to stand in the hallway forever when inside you. The feeling is already growing that something bad is about to happen. I opened the door and saw them. I won't describe any details, because when you find yourself in such a situation, your brain doesn't fixate on specific actions or movements. It fixes on only one powerful emotional blow that literally passes through your entire body. And at that moment, I felt exactly that blow. When the air suddenly became heavy, when pressure appeared in my chest, and my head became strangely empty. I simply stood in the doorway, looking at my husband and the woman next to him. And in the first second, my brain didn't even try to call what was happening infidelity. It simply froze, like a computer that received too much information at once. The first thing that struck me wasn't even the betrayal itself, but my husband's facial expression, because I expected to see fear, panic, confusion, or at least some instant remorse. Instead, I saw the expression of a person who understands he's been caught, but doesn't yet know how serious the consequences will be. And it was this expression that hurt far more than any scream or excuse, because in it there was no sense that he had made a mistake. In it was the sense that an unpleasant situation had occurred, which he would now have to somehow explain. I continued standing in the doorway looking at them, and at that moment, something strange was happening inside me. A division, because one part of me wanted to scream, make a scene, demand explanations, and immediately destroy everything around, while another part, much colder and quieter, simply observed what was happening as if it were a scene from a movie. And I noticed that my husband was looking at me as if assessing the situation and trying to understand exactly how much I had seen and what I had already understood. But the real blow didn't happen at that moment. The real blow happened when I looked at the woman. At first, she was standing with her side to me, and I couldn't see her face fully, and my brain tried to turn on protection again, because it began telling me that this was just someone unfamiliar, a random woman, a banal infidelity that destroys a marriage but still remains an ordinary human story that can be understood, explained, or at least attempted to be survived. Then she turned her head, and I saw her face. And in that second, I felt real shock because my brain at first refused to accept what I saw. And a strange thought appeared in my head that this was simply a person who looked very much like her. That there are such coincidences when people have similar facial features, similar eyes, similar smile, and that I was simply in a state of stress and seeing what wasn't actually there. But it was her. My sister, the person I grew up with, the person with whom I had hundreds of childhood memories, the person who knew me better than most people in my life. And it was at that moment that something final happened inside me. Because if before this my brain had tried to preserve at least part of the previous reality, now it became clear that there was nothing left to preserve. I stood looking at both of them, and memories of recent years began surfacing in my head. All the family gatherings, all the holidays, all the moments when we sat at the same table, when she came to visit us, when we discussed work because we worked at the same company, just in different offices. Back then, all of this seemed like ordinary life with family, support, and trust. But now these memories began to look completely different, because in each of them, a new thought appeared that perhaps all this time, something was already happening between them. And the longer I stood in the doorway, the stronger the feeling of humiliation became. Because if this wasn't an accident, if this wasn't one stupid moment, then it had been going on for a long time. And if it had been going on for a long time, then I was the last person who knew nothing. The last one. And it was then that a thought appeared in my head which turned out to be scarier than the scene of infidelity itself, because I suddenly realized that I didn't know exactly how long this story had been going on. And the more I looked at their faces, the more I felt that the truth could turn out to be much worse than I was capable of imagining in that second. And it was at that moment that I finally understood one thing. Whatever the truth was, my previous life ended in that second when I opened that door. After that day, I didn't stay in the house, because staying there would have meant feeling every second that everything around was infected by what I had seen. And just a few hours after I caught them together, I packed the most necessary things, doing it quickly and almost mechanically, without screams, without tears, and without conversations, because inside me was a strange state of cold shock when a person simply performs actions one after another to prevent thoughts from completely tearing their head apart. I remember folding clothes, documents, a laptop, and several small things into my bag. Things that seemed important only because at that moment I was desperately trying to preserve at least some illusion of control over what was happening. Although in reality, I already felt that control was completely lost. I went to a friend's house, and the drive to her place passed almost in a fog, because several times I caught myself thinking that just this morning my life had looked ordinary and predictable, and now I had essentially fled from my own home, not understanding if I would ever return there. When I arrived, she immediately understood from my face that something serious had happened, but didn't press me with questions. She simply gave me a room and said I could stay as long as needed. And this simple human calm was the only island of normality at that moment when everything inside me was gradually falling apart. I sat on the couch with my phone in my hands because I knew that sooner or later one of them would write or call. And about an hour after I arrived, the screen lit up with a new message. When I saw the sender's name, my breath stopped for a second, because it was my sister, and part of me still hoped that her words would contain at least a hint of regret or an attempt to explain what was happening. But when I opened the message, I felt such cold inside that it's impossible to describe calmly. The message was short, almost dry, without emotions and without long explanations, and its meaning was so cruel that at first I reread the text several times, trying to convince myself that I was misunderstanding the meaning. But the meaning was exactly what was written there, because she directly said that she was pleased I had finally experienced the pain I was supposed to experience, and that she had actually been counting on me finding out about their relationship much later, when everything would have gone even further, and when the blow would be much stronger, because, according to her words, it would have hurt me much more then. At that moment, I felt not just betrayal, but some strange sensation of complete loss of reality. Because one thing is to catch your husband cheating and even learn that the other woman was your sister, but quite another is to receive a message from her in which she essentially confesses that everything happening gives her satisfaction, and that she had been planning to make this moment even more devastating. I sat for a long time with the phone in my hands, looking at this text, because I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that a person I grew up with, a person who shared my childhood, could so calmly and coldly write such things. And at that moment, a new feeling appeared in me that turned out to be even stronger than pain. It was the feeling of humiliation, because it became clear that in this story, I was not simply a victim of random infidelity, but part of someone's conscious plan. The next day, my husband called, and at first I didn't want to answer because after my sister's message, everything inside became even heavier. But at some point, I realized that the conversation was inevitable anyway, because 10 years of marriage can't simply be erased by silence. And I picked up the phone, trying to speak as calmly as possible, although inside me everything was still boiling with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and confusion. He said he wanted to come over and talk in person, and that he understood how serious the situation had become. And in his voice, for the first time during all this time, there appeared real fatigue and tension, as if he had finally realized the scale of the destruction that had occurred. I agreed to the meeting because I needed to hear his version of events fully, without short messages and without attempts to hide behind distance. When he arrived at my friend's house, I saw on his face an expression that hadn't been there that day when I opened the bedroom door, because now there was a mixture of remorse, fear, and confusion. We sat and talked for a long time, and he spoke most of the time, because he was the one trying to explain how everything began and how it went so far. He said that the relationship with my sister didn't begin as betrayal, but as conversations, as emotional support, as gradual closeness that at first seemed harmless, and that he had long convinced himself that everything remained under control. But gradually the boundaries began to disappear, and the situation became what it became. And while he was telling this, I felt a strange sensation, because in his words there was much regret, but almost no clear answer to the main question: why he continued this for years. The hardest moment was the admission that their relationship had lasted much longer than I could have imagined. And although he tried to speak carefully and soften the formulations, it became clear that we were talking not about several months, and not even about 1 year, but about a long period in which he led a double life, where our marriage existed and a secret connection with my sister existed. When I heard this, I felt such humiliation that is difficult to explain in words, because it meant that many moments of my life had been false, that family gatherings, conversations, holidays, and ordinary days took place against a background of lies, known to both people now sitting on opposite sides of this story. He said that now he understood how far everything had gone, that he was ready to end this relationship and didn't want to lose our marriage, and that only now did he realize he had destroyed trust in the heaviest way. And while he was saying all this, I sat remembering my sister's message, in which she directly wrote that she wanted to make this pain even stronger. And it was then that I understood one frightening thing. If she truly wanted me to find out later and for it to hurt more, then this whole story could have been much more calculated than I had assumed until now. The first week after everything came out passed in a state that is difficult to call life, because it was rather an existence between short bouts of anxiety, long hours of emptiness, and attempts to convince myself that I still controlled at least part of my reality. I spent most of this time at my friend's house, almost never leaving, turning off notifications, not answering relatives' calls, and avoiding any conversations that could return me to that scene, which I was still replaying in my head dozens of times, trying to understand how exactly my life could have turned into this strange and humiliating story. But after a week, I still decided to return to work, because work was the only place that previously gave me a sense of structure and meaning. I thought that if I started living by a normal schedule again, then at least part of my life would stop revolving around betrayal, scandals, and endless conversations about what had happened in my marriage. And when I entered the office that morning, I felt a strange atmosphere because people were behaving as if they knew something I hadn't yet guessed. The first few hours passed tensely but calmly because I tried to concentrate on tasks and not pay attention to colleagues' glances. However, closer to lunch, I received a message from the director's secretary asking me to come to his office. And it was at that moment that an unpleasant feeling appeared inside me that is difficult to explain logically, because it was like a premonition of another blow. When I entered the office, I immediately saw several folders with documents on the desk, and the director's facial expression was tense and cautious, as if he was preparing to speak about something unpleasant. The conversation began very officially because he said that an internal audit was being conducted regarding the financial part of one of the projects, and that during this audit, documents with signatures and corrections had been discovered that looked suspicious. At first, I didn't understand where he was leading, because such audits sometimes happen in large projects and don't always mean serious accusations. But then he said a phrase that made my hands literally go cold, because these documents had allegedly been processed in my name and looked as if I had altered the project's financial data, redirecting part of the funds to external accounts. At that moment, I felt that same cold shock I had already experienced a week ago, because the accusation sounded so absurd that my brain at first simply refused to accept it. I tried to calmly explain that this was impossible, that I had never worked with these files in this form, and that all financial operations go through several levels of verification. But the director looked like a person who had already seen enough documents to begin doubting. The hardest moment was that the picture really did look suspicious, because there were changes in the system made from an account used by me, and these changes concerned exactly that part of the budget, which would allow creating an unnoticed reserve of funds. And when he cautiously asked if I understood how all this could look from the outside, I suddenly realized that the situation looked as if I had indeed been preparing a financial cushion for myself. And it was then that another detail surfaced that made everything even worse, because rumors about my family problems had already begun spreading, and some colleagues knew that my marriage was on the verge of collapse. And in this version of events, everything added up into one logical but absolutely false picture, where I supposedly learned about my husband's affair, decided that the marriage would soon end, and began withdrawing money from the project in advance to secure my future. When I left the office, I had the feeling that the ground had finally gone out from under my feet, because I understood that this story was going far beyond personal betrayal. And it was then that for the first time a thought arose in my head, which I at first tried to drive away because it seemed too scary. But the more I thought about what was happening, the clearer it became that someone was consciously creating a situation in which I looked guilty. I knew one important thing: my sister worked at the same company, just in another office, and her team had access to part of the documents for this project. I also knew that the office where she worked had long been discussing her relationship with my husband, because such things rarely remain secret in a collective where people constantly intersect at meetings and events. The next few days turned into a real nervous war, because the audit continued. I was called in for conversations, asked new questions, requested to explain every detail of working with documents. And although I knew I had done nothing, the feeling of suspicion from those around me gradually began to press, because sometimes enough correctly arranged details are enough for even an innocent person to begin looking questionable. I barely slept, because I constantly replayed the same question in my head: who did this and why? And the longer this situation lasted, the stronger the feeling became that everything happening coincided too precisely with what my sister had written in her message, where she directly said that she wanted to make my pain stronger. The turning point happened by accident, when I requested access to recordings from surveillance cameras installed in the archive zone of the office, where physical copies of documents were sometimes worked with. At first, this was almost a desperate attempt to find at least some clue, because if the changes weren't made by me, then someone must have worked with the materials in a room where there were cameras. The technical employee and I began reviewing recordings for the needed dates, and the first hours yielded no results, because the video showed ordinary office work: people coming and going, taking folders, returning them to their places. And almost at the end of the review, I noticed a figure that at first glance looked like me. The person looked so much like me that if I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed it was me, because my sister and I have similar height, similar build, and similar movements. And it was apparently on this that the entire calculation was built. But then one small movement happened on the recording that changed everything. The person bent over the desk to get a folder from the bottom shelf, and at that moment hair fell on the shoulders, exposing the back of the neck. And then the tattoo became visible, a small design at the base of the neck, which I knew too well because I had seen it many times in family photographs. My sister had this tattoo. I didn't have it. When I showed this moment to the director, a heavy silence fell in the office because it became obvious that the person on the video was not me, even if at first glance we looked almost identical. And it was at that moment that something important happened inside me. For the first time during all this time, I stopped feeling like a victim. After the director saw the recording from the camera where the tattoo on the neck was clearly visible, the situation changed almost instantly. Because until that moment, conversations had been built around suspicions and assumptions. But now there appeared a fact that couldn't be ignored. And already the next day, management decided to call my sister to the main office for an official investigation. Because if a person from another branch used access to documents and set up an employee in such a large project, this was no longer an internal misunderstanding, but a serious violation that could put at risk relations with a very important client. I remember that day very clearly, because inside me was a strange state where anxiety, anger, and cold expectation were simultaneously mixed. And when I was invited to be present at the conversation, at first I wanted to refuse, because after everything that had happened, I had no desire to look at her again. But then I realized that this was the moment that could put a period on this entire story. And if I left now, I would spend my whole life wondering what exactly she would say and why all this had begun. When she entered the office, she looked completely calm, and this calmness turned out to be almost frightening, because most people in such a situation begin making excuses, getting nervous, or at least trying to soften what was happening. But she looked like a person who had already accepted the consequences and was simply waiting for everything to end. The conversation began officially, with questions about access to documents, about how she ended up in the archive zone of the office on those days when the changes were made. And when she was shown the recording from the camera where the tattoo was visible, she didn't even try to deny the obvious. She simply looked at the screen and said that yes, it was indeed her. Silence fell in the room because the admission sounded so calm that for a second it became unclear whether she realized the scale of what she had just said. And the director asked her directly why she had done this, because we were talking about a project with a huge budget and an important client, and such actions could destroy not only my career, but the reputation of the entire company. And it was then that she began speaking about a reason that turned out to be so petty and simultaneously so devastating that at first I didn't even understand what she was talking about. She reminded me of one old story from college that I had almost forgotten, because for me it was one of hundreds of ordinary episodes of youth, when people make stupid mistakes and then simply move on. But for her, this episode turned out to be something completely different, because it was about a guy she liked back then, many years ago, with whom I once had a short affair that meant nothing to me and quickly ended. She said that it was at that moment that she first got the feeling that I always took from her what she wanted, that I always ended up ahead, that people always chose me, and that for her this became the beginning of a grievance that only grew over the years, because she felt like my shadow, a person who was constantly compared to me. She told this calmly, without tears and without hysteria, as if talking about some old fact that had long stopped causing emotions. And the longer she spoke, the clearer it became that this grievance had turned into something much heavier than simple jealousy or childhood anger, because over time she began perceiving my life as proof of her own failure. She directly said that she hadn't succeeded in relationships, that she hadn't had a family, that she felt lonely and constantly compared her life to mine. And at some point, a thought formed inside her that the only way to restore balance was to destroy what I had. And then she made the decision to begin a relationship with my husband, because she knew that this would hit me the hardest. And when she spoke about this, there was no regret or shame in her voice, only a cold explanation of the logic she had been guided by. And she confessed that these relationships were originally part of revenge, not the result of sudden feelings. When the conversation turned to the documents, she said that she decided to go further because she wanted my life to begin collapsing not only in the personal sphere, but in the professional one as well. And the idea to forge financial changes in the project appeared exactly when she learned that our marriage was on the edge. Because from the outside, this would look logical, as if I myself had begun preparing a financial cushion in case of divorce. She said this almost calmly, as if explaining an ordinary work strategy. And it was at that moment that I felt strange relief, because all that confusion of recent weeks finally added up into one clear picture where there were no accidents, no emotional weaknesses, and no misunderstandings. It was a plan, a long and cold plan that had begun forming many years ago because of an episode I barely remembered. After her confession, management quickly made a decision because the project was indeed too large and too important to turn the situation into a public scandal that could attract the client's attention and destroy the contract. So everything was decided within the company as quickly and quietly as possible. She was fired from her current position, but instead of an official scandal, a decision was made to transfer her to another state, to one of the most remote and problematic branches of the company, where employees with whom they no longer wanted to deal in the main offices were usually sent. When everything ended and people began dispersing, for the first time in a long time, I felt that the tension that had held me these past weeks was beginning to weaken slightly, because the truth had finally stopped being hidden. A few days later, I rented a small apartment and began living separately, because returning to the old house no longer made sense, and my husband soon completely left my life, because after everything that had happened, nothing remained between us that could be restored. I continued working at the same company, because leaving would have meant allowing this entire story to destroy yet another part of my life. And although the first weeks were difficult because of conversations and colleagues' glances, gradually everything began returning to a normal work rhythm. But inside me remained one feeling that I still can't fully explain. I didn't feel victory. I only felt strange emptiness, because this entire story began because of a grievance that turned out to be so strong that a person could destroy several lives at once for the sensation of revenge. Several months passed, and life gradually returned to some working rhythm that could be called habit, because the emotional emptiness left after the betrayal turned out to be too deep to simply fill with new events. The first days, weeks, and months, I felt that I was walking on the surface of my own life, trying to do everything that had previously seemed ordinary, but internally remaining somewhere between shock and constant tension. Because betrayal by a close person leaves not only wounds, but a constant feeling of distrust toward reality and toward people with whom you previously lived side by side. I rented my own apartment, furnished it to my taste, and this was the first decision in a long time that fully belonged only to me. Because everything else, marriage, work, relatives, at some point turned out to be alien. And although a rented apartment couldn't return the past, it gave a feeling of control and safety that in the first weeks after everything that had happened became almost necessary for survival. And for the first time, I felt that I could make decisions only for myself, without looking back at anyone else, even if this feeling hadn't yet returned peace or happiness. Work became not only a source of income, but a way to keep my brain in tone, because every project, every meeting, every assignment required concentration that helped push out thoughts of betrayal. And gradually, I learned not to think about the past in the first hours of the day, focusing on tasks. Although in the evening, memories still returned and forced me to relive every moment, every detail, every phrase that once destroyed my trust. My ex-husband was no longer a part of my life, and this was simultaneously a relief and a source of new emptiness, because nothing depended on him anymore but the habit of waiting for a call, discussing little things, sharing something ordinary that would never happen again remained an empty shadow of what was before. And sometimes it seemed to me that I would have to relearn how to trust myself and my feelings, because after such large-scale betrayal, no one can remain the same. My sister is now far away, in a branch that almost no one has heard of, and sometimes I catch myself thinking that the feeling of grievance that lived in her for so many years has finally found an outlet. But at the same time, she remained for me a strange shadow, a person who destroyed years of my life for her own feeling of truth or revenge. And although physically she no longer interferes, her actions left a mark that is impossible to erase. Over time, it became clear that there would be no perfect resolution, because life doesn't give us such finished stories. There is no fair punishment. There is no full restoration of trust. There is no exact moment when you can say it's all over because everything remains inside. And it was this inner knowledge that became a lesson for me, that trust needs to be cherished, but it can be lost forever, and that the closest people can cause pain not out of malice, but out of their own grievances and weaknesses that they carry for decades. And I learned to live with this. I continue working, building my own space, sometimes meeting new people, sometimes remembering old moments, and sometimes a strange thought arises that I could take revenge in return, that I could fight back. But almost immediately, I understand that my real decision is not to take revenge, but simply to stop being part of others' games, others' anger, and others' ambitions. Because strength now is not in revenge, but in remaining yourself. Even if the past sometimes returns in the form of memories, messages, glances, and shadows of what was once my home, my family, and my trust. And sometimes I think, if a person is capable of causing so much pain for an old grievance, does this mean that we ourselves should seek justice? Or is it enough to simply choose our own life and learn to move forward, leaving the past behind the door, even if the door never fully closes? Life after betrayal is not retribution. It is not perfect restoration. It is a constant choice, every day deciding who you are and what you want, despite everything that once destroyed your world. And in this, perhaps, is the only real freedom.